Paris, March 12, 1932. A valet knocks on the bedroom door of apartment 5 on Avenue Victor Emmanuel Tree. No answer. He knocks again. Inside, on the bed, lies Ivar Kreuger, the man American newspapers called the Match King, the man who once controlled 2/3 of the world's matchstick production. There is a gunshot wound. There is a revolver. There is no clear note. Weeks later, investigators open his safe. Inside they find Italian government bonds worth roughly $42 million. He had promised investors his securities were as safe as a government bond. It turns out he had simply forged one. He was born in Kalmar, Sweden, on March 2nd, 888, into a family already in the match business. A small, unglamorous industry that would one day make him one of the richest men on earth. Kreuger was clever in the way that gets noticed early. He studied mining and civil engineering at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Then went further, traveling to the United States, absorbing new construction techniques, new ways of building faster and cheaper with reinforced concrete. He came home with more than an education. He came home with confidence, contacts, and an appetite for scale that Sweden's small business world had rarely seen. In 1908, Kreuger co-founded a construction firm with a partner named Paul Toll. Kreuger and Toll. It was a real company doing real work. Pouring concrete, raising buildings, riding the wave of Sweden's modernization. Kreuger proved himself a genuine talent, efficient, ambitious, unafraid of debt when debt built something tangible. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it matters for everything that follows. The fraud that would eventually collapse an empire did not begin as a fraud. It began as a legitimate business, run by a legitimately gifted man. Then, in 1913, Kreuger became managing director of Svenska Tändsticksaktiebolaget, Swedish match, formed by merging the country's rival matchmakers. Within a few years, by around 1917, the consolidation was complete. Sweden's match industry answered to one man. But Kreuger did not stop at Sweden. Through the 1920s he expanded outward, buying, merging, absorbing competitors, until, by most estimates, his companies controlled something like 2/3 of the entire world's match production. 200 companies, operating across somewhere between 30 and 40 countries. A humble household product had become a global monopoly, and Ivar Kreuger held the only key. Here is where the genius curdles into something else. Post-war Europe was broke. Governments needed cash and had nowhere good to borrow it. Kreuger saw the opportunity immediately, lend the money himself, in exchange for the one thing he actually wanted: a national monopoly on matches. In 1927, he loaned France roughly $75 million. In return, France granted his companies the exclusive right to sell matches within its borders. It was elegant, it was audacious. A private Swedish businessman was effectively financing European governments and being paid back in monopoly rights instead of monopoly money. By 1929, he'd done the same with Germany. A loan reported at around $125 million for another monopoly. To fund all this lending, Kreuger needed capital, and he found it in America. Through the Boston banking house Lee, Higginson & Co. and its partner Donald Durant, Kreuger and Toll sold something called participating debentures to American investors. Complex securities, marketed with an irresistible pitch, as safe as a government bond, backed by a business that controlled 2/3 of a product every household needed. Americans bought it eagerly. Few of them ever saw an independent audit of the company they were funding. Few of them asked to. There were warnings, if anyone wanted to hear them. Kreuger's holding company structure was deliberately opaque. A maze of subsidiaries across dozens of countries, designed so that no single accountant, no single government, could see the whole picture. He refused outside audits of the parent company entirely. A few skeptical analysts noted this as a red flag before the collapse. They were drowned out by the returns. Then, in October 1929, Wall Street crashed. Suddenly capital was harder to raise, governments were more desperate, and the machine Kreuger had built, which required constant new money to keep paying returns on the old money, began to run out of road. Between 1929 and 1931, Kreuger crossed the final line. He invented assets that did not exist. He falsified balance sheets to hide liquidity shortfalls that were growing every quarter. And, most brazenly, he forged Italian government bonds. Physically fabricated documents meant to look like sovereign debt, to plug holes in his accounts and reassure lenders that his empire was as solid as ever. Let that sit for a moment. Dewey 418. The man who sold his own securities as being as safe as a government bond had, by this point, resorted to counterfeiting an actual one. On March 12, 1932, Ivar Kreuger was found dead in his Paris apartment. A gunshot wound the cause. It was officially ruled a suicide. The timing has fueled conspiracy theories for nearly a century. Some have wondered whether a man so central to so much money could really have died so conveniently, just before the truth came out. But no solid evidence of foul play has ever surfaced. What the historical record shows, quietly and without drama. First, he's a man who built something enormous on a foundation of paper. Non-dacit and who could see, better than anyone, that the paper was running out. Within weeks, Price Waterhouse auditors were called in to examine the wreckage. What they found stung them: the forged Italian bonds, worth roughly $142 million in face value, sitting in his safe; fabricated assets, falsified accounts stretching back years. The empire unraveled almost overnight. Lee, Higginson & Co., the Boston bank that had championed Kreuger's securities across America, collapsed alongside him. Lawsuits followed, against the bank, against auditors Ernst & Ernst, against anyone who might have known and said nothing. It would take years for the courts and the victims to sort through what was left. The human cost was enormous and largely invisible in the history books. Ordinary American investors, people who had trusted a name synonymous with safety, lost their savings when the debentures they held turned out to be built on invented assets. Estimates of total losses worldwide range widely, from roughly $250 million to as much as $500 million. Stock markets in Stockholm, London, and New York were shaken by the scandal for months. Swedish Match itself survived, reorganized under new honest management. But for thousands of families who had believed in the Match King's promise of safety, the money simply did not come back. So we closed the ledger on the Match King. In just over a decade, he built control over roughly 2/3 of the world's match production, spanning some 200 companies across 30 to 40 countries. He loaned $75 million to France and roughly $125 million to Germany, buying monopolies with borrowed confidence. When it collapsed, investors worldwide lost somewhere between $250 million and $500 million. In his safe, auditors found $142 million in bonds he had forged himself. He died on March 12, 1932, officially by his own hand. Here is the final irony. The scandal that ruined so many became one of the cases American lawmakers cited when they built the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The modern rules meant to stop the next Ivar Kreuger before he ever gets the chance. The company he built through deception, Swedish Match, still exists today, legitimate and profitable. The lie collapsed. The business it hid inside outlived him. The ledger never balances. Subscribe. Next week, the ledger opens again.